Her world felt completely shattered, until a heavenly touch restored her hope in a single moment. I remember the exact moment my world began to fall apart. It was early morning, the kind of overcast day that sets a somber tone before anything even happens. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the letter in my hands. My fingers trembled, the crisp paper crinkling slightly under the pressure. It was just a single page, thin and weightless in reality, but in that moment, it felt as heavy as an anvil. "We regret to inform you." My eyes glazed over as I read the rest. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I couldn't. The words blurred together, a jumble of professional disappointment neatly wrapped in corporate jargon. My dream job, the one I'd worked for years to qualify for, had slipped through my fingers without warning. After countless applications, interviews, sleepless nights, and prayers, it was gone. Just like that, I sat there for a long time, staring at the paper as if it would change, as if some hidden message in invisible ink would appear to explain why this was happening. But of course, nothing happened. Nothing changed. The sound of the neighbor's dog barking outside jolted me from my stupor. I folded the letter neatly, tucking it back into the envelope as though that would somehow soften the blow. It didn't. I stood up mechanically, put the kettle on, and stared out the window as I waited for the water to boil. My small apartment, which I'd once found cozy and full of potential, suddenly felt stifling. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me with the weight of everything that was going wrong. 2 weeks earlier, my boyfriend, no, ex-boyfriend, had blindsided me with a breakup. After 3 years together, he decided we were moving in different directions. That's how he'd phrased it anyway. I didn't even know what that meant. All I knew was that I was left with a collection of his old hoodies I didn't know what to do with, and an ache in my chest that refused to go away. Now this. The rejection letter felt like the final nail in the coffin of my dwindling hope. First love, now career. Was there anything left to lose? The kettle whistled, and I poured the water over a tea bag, watching the liquid swirl into a dull brown. My hands shook slightly as I carried the cup back to the table. I took a sip, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves, but it only reminded me how cold and numb I felt inside. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to distract myself by tackling a long list of errands, but nothing seemed to help. The world around me buzzed with life. People laughing, cars honking, shopkeepers chatting with customers, but I felt like I was moving through a fog. Detached. Invisible. I caught myself staring at a group of teenagers in the park, their carefree laughter echoing in the crisp air. They didn't have to worry about job rejections or broken hearts. I envied their innocence, their freedom to exist without the crushing weight of adult responsibilities. By the time I got home, the sky had turned a deep shade of gray, threatening rain. I collapsed onto the couch, too drained to even bother with dinner. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, but I ignored it. It was probably my mom, checking in again. She meant well, but I couldn't handle another conversation where I had to pretend everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It wasn't even close. That night, I crawled into bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What was the point of trying so hard if it always ended in failure? Was I destined to be stuck in this cycle of disappointment forever? I hated how melodramatic I felt, but the pain was real. It gnawed at me, growing louder and sharper with every passing minute. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it was restless and filled with fragmented dreams that left me even more exhausted by morning. The next day, I woke up to the dull ache of reality settling back in. It wasn't just a bad dream. This was my life now. I dragged myself out of bed, feeling like a shell of the person I used to be. The version of me that had been optimistic, ambitious, and full of hope felt like a distant memory. I went through the motions of my morning routine, but everything felt off. Even my favorite mug, the one with the cheerful sunflower pattern, didn't bring the usual comfort. The walls of my apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every corner reminded me of plans that had fallen apart and dreams that felt out of reach. By mid-morning, I found myself back at the kitchen table, the rejection letter lying in front of me like a cruel reminder. I read it again, hoping to find some hidden meaning, some clue that would make it hurt less. But all I found were cold, impersonal words that stung as much as they had the first time. Tears welled up in my eyes, and this time I didn't fight them. I let them fall, hot and heavy, dripping onto the letter and smudging the ink. I hated crying. It made me feel weak, vulnerable. But in that moment, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my grief. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed irrelevant. All I knew was that the weight of my pain was too much to bear alone, yet I didn't know who to turn to. My friends would try to cheer me up, but they wouldn't understand. Not really, and I couldn't bring myself to burden my family with more bad news. Eventually, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and took a deep breath, though it felt more like a gasp. The tears had left me feeling raw and drained, but there was a strange sense of release too. As if letting myself break down had opened a tiny crack in the fortress of despair I'd built around myself. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a single fragile thought. Maybe this isn't the end. Maybe there's something else waiting for me. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a seed. Small and barely noticeable, but there. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to get me through the day. The morning after my breakdown began just like any other, me dragging myself out of bed, weighed down by the lingering fog of hopelessness. The sunlight, diffused through gray clouds, spilled into my room as if mocking my mood. I shuffled into the kitchen, barely paying attention as I reached for the coffee maker. It was while waiting for the machine to gurgle to life that I noticed something odd. A thin blue envelope, its deep color striking against the dull beige of my doorframe, was sticking out from underneath the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting mail, especially not something as elegant as this. My mind raced as I approached it. Had someone left it by mistake? Did I even want to open it? But curiosity overruled caution, and I reached down to pick it up. The envelope was heavier than it looked, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. There was no address, no name, just a swirling pattern of gold filigree etched along the edges. Sliding a single card out, I held my breath. In crisp, bold lettering it read, "Hope is nearer than you think." I blinked, unsure what to make of it. There was no signature, no explanation. Just those 6 words. Hope is nearer than you think. The words were simple, but they carried a strange weight, as though they were meant for me specifically. For a long moment, I just stood there turning the card over in my hands. Was it a prank? A mistake? Maybe one of my neighbors had meant to leave it for someone else. But there was no name or identifying mark to confirm that. Against my better judgment, I tucked the card into the pocket of my hoodie. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to dismiss it as a meaningless gesture, but another part, a quiet, desperate part, wanted to believe there was more to it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, yet the card lingered in the back of my mind. I found myself pulling it out of my pocket more than once, running my fingers over the textured paper. The phrase replayed in my head like a mantra. Hope is nearer than you think. That evening, I ventured out for a walk. The air was crisp, and the sky had cleared just enough to reveal faint streaks of orange and pink on the horizon. The park near my apartment was quiet, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. I hadn't been there in weeks, not since before the breakup, and the familiarity of it felt both comforting and jarring. I chose a path lined with tall oak trees, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral. With each step, I tried to sort through my thoughts to make sense of everything that had happened. The rejection, the breakup, the sense of failure that seemed to cling to me no matter how hard I tried to shake it. I was so lost in thought that I nearly missed her. Sitting on a bench beneath one of the largest oaks was a woman I'd never seen before. She looked out of place in the best way, like someone who had wandered in from a different world. Her hair was streaked with silver, pulled back into a loose braid that cascaded over one shoulder. She wore a long, flowing coat, the deep burgundy fabric catching the fading sunlight. She was writing in a small notebook, her pen moving across the page with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should approach her. But then she looked up, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that stopped me in my tracks. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" she said, her voice warm and inviting. I nodded, though I didn't feel beautiful or warm in the slightest. "Yeah, I guess." She gestured to the empty spot on the bench beside her. "Join me?" There was something about her, something I couldn't quite place, that made it impossible to refuse. I sat down, leaving a respectful distance between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. I watched as she continued to write, her pen gliding effortlessly across the page. Finally, she set the notebook aside and turned to me with a gentle smile. "You look like you're carrying something heavy." I felt my throat tighten. How could she possibly know that? My instinct was to brush her off, to assure her I was fine, but the words refused to come. Instead, I found myself telling her everything. The rejection letter, the breakup, the crushing sense of failure and loss. Once I started, it all spilled out, raw and unfiltered. She listened without interrupting, her expression soft and attentive. When I finally finished, she took a deep breath, as though she had been carrying my pain alongside me. "I'm sorry you've been through so much," she said. "But do you know what I see when I look at you?" I shook my head, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. "I see someone who hasn't given up, someone who's still searching, still trying, even when it feels impossible." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I don't feel like I'm trying," I admitted. "I feel like I'm just surviving. And sometimes," she said softly, "that's enough. Surviving is the first step toward healing." She reached for her notebook and tore out a blank page, folding it neatly before handing it to me. "Write," she said, "not for anyone else, but for yourself. Write what you're feeling, what you're afraid of, what you're hoping for, even if it feels silly. You might be surprised by what you discover." I hesitated, unsure if I could follow through. But the sincerity in her eyes left no room for doubt. I took the paper and tucked it into my pocket alongside the mysterious card. As I stood to leave, she placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light but grounding, like an anchor in a storm. "You're not alone," she said, "even when it feels like you are." I walked away feeling lighter than I had in weeks, though I couldn't explain why. The woman, whoever she was, hadn't solved my problems. She hadn't offered me a roadmap or a quick fix. But she'd given me something I hadn't realized I needed: permission to feel, to grieve, and maybe to hope. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I pulled out the page she'd given me and began to write. My handwriting was shaky, my thoughts scattered, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I still didn't know who had left the card under my door or why the woman had appeared when she did. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, hope really was nearer than I thought. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not drastically better. Not as though the weight of the world had been lifted, but there was a subtle shift inside me. A small ember where before there had been nothing but cold ash. I didn't know if it was the card, the woman, or the act of writing the night before, but something had changed. It wasn't hope. Not fully, but it was close enough to keep me moving. I went about my usual routine: coffee, toast, a quick shower. The card and the folded piece of paper sat on the counter, staring back at me like a reminder that maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. As I sipped my coffee, I picked up the paper and read the messy, fragmented words I'd scrawled late last night. They weren't poetic or profound. They were raw, jagged pieces of my mind spilled onto the page. And yet, there was something liberating about seeing my thoughts laid bare, as though putting them on paper had lessened their grip on me. After breakfast, I decided I needed to get out of the apartment. The walls were starting to feel too familiar, too suffocating. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I grabbed my notebook and headed out the door. The air outside was cool and crisp, the kind of autumn morning that hinted at the promise of change. Leaves crunched beneath my sneakers as I wandered aimlessly through the streets. I eventually found myself back at the park, drawn by some invisible force. The memory of the woman from yesterday lingered in my mind. I wondered if she would be there again, though I wasn't sure what I would even say to her. Thank you? Who are you? How did you know I needed to hear those words? The thought made me nervous, but a part of me hoped I'd see her. The park was alive with activity. Children laughed as they chased each other across the grass. A couple strolled hand in hand, their smiles warm and easy. Even the dogs seemed to be enjoying the day, tails wagging as they bounded through piles of fallen leaves. It was the kind of scene that should have made me feel better, but instead, it stirred a pang of loneliness in my chest. All these people, so full of life, while I still felt like I was trudging through quicksand. I found an empty bench near the pond and sat down, pulling out my notebook. The page from last night was still folded neatly in the back, but I didn't unfold it. Instead, I flipped to a blank page and stared at it, pen in hand. My thoughts swirled chaotically, too fast to catch, and for a moment, I considered giving up. But then I remembered her words. Write what you're feeling, what you're afraid of, what you're hoping for, even if it feels silly. So I did. At first, the words came out haltingly, like drops of water from a leaky faucet. But the more I wrote, the easier it became. I wrote about my fear of failure, about the rejection that had left me questioning my worth. I wrote about the breakup and the ache it had left behind. I wrote about the card, the woman, and the strange sense of comfort her presence had brought me. And as the words filled the page, something unexpected happened. The knot in my chest began to loosen ever so slightly. Writing again, are we? A voice said, startling me. I looked up to find her standing a few feet away, her serene smile as familiar as it was surprising. She looked exactly as she had yesterday, calm, composed, and somehow radiating warmth. How had I not noticed her approach? You scared me, I admitted, setting my pen down. Apologies, she said, though her smile suggested she wasn't all that sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. I just wanted to see how you were doing. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Part of me wanted to tell her the truth, that I felt a little better but was still far from okay. Another part of me didn't want to admit how much her words had affected me. I'm better, I think, I said finally. Still figuring things out. That's progress, she said, her tone gentle but firm. Sometimes figuring things out is all you can do. She gestured to the bench, and I nodded, shifting over to make room. She sat beside me, her presence as calming as it had been yesterday. For a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the world go by. The pond reflected the sky, a patchwork of blue and white, while ducks glided lazily across its surface. It was peaceful, almost meditative. I wrote, I said eventually, breaking the silence. Last night, like you suggested, and again today. Her smile widened, and she nodded approvingly. Good. Writing is a powerful thing. It helps you untangle the mess in your mind. I don't know if it's helping yet, I admitted, glancing down at the notebook in my lap. But it feels easier, I guess. Like I can breathe a little better. That's more than enough, she said. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a series of small steps. I turned to her, unable to hold back the question that had been gnawing at me. Who are you? Her smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. Just someone who's been where you are. Someone who knows what it's like to feel lost. Her answer was vague, but there was no dishonesty in her voice. I wanted to press further, to ask why she had approached me in the first place, but something told me not to. Instead, I asked, why do you care? About me? I mean, you don't even know me. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering her answer. Sometimes, when we find our way out of the dark, it's only natural to want to help others do the same. And you seemed like someone who needed a little light. Her words struck a chord deep within me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The sincerity in her voice, the kindness in her eyes, it was overwhelming. I wasn't used to people caring so deeply without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can say that enough." "You don't need to," she replied, her smile softening. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Keep writing. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You'll find your answers there. I promise." I nodded, clutching the notebook a little tighter. She stood then, her movements graceful and unhurried. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice warm but firm. "And remember, hope is always nearer than you think." I watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the trees. This time, I didn't feel the need to chase after her or demand answers. Instead, I sat there, letting her words sink in. The ember inside me burned a little brighter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't dared to hope for. I felt okay. When I got home that evening, the apartment didn't feel quite as suffocating as it usually did. The air still felt heavy, and the silence still pressed against me, but it wasn't unbearable. There was something else, something quieter and gentler, a sense that I wasn't completely adrift, even if I didn't yet know where I was headed. I set my notebook on the kitchen table, letting it sit there like an invitation. Part of me wanted to dive right in, to keep writing while the memory of the woman's words was still fresh in my mind. But another part of me hesitated, unsure if I could handle the emotions that might surface. Writing, I was quickly learning, wasn't just an act of putting words on paper. It was like opening a door to parts of myself I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as the sun dipped below the horizon. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't immediately look away. There were dark circles under my eyes and a tiredness in my expression that hadn't been there before, but there was also something else, a quiet determination. After a while, I reached for the notebook. The weight of it in my hands felt comforting, grounding. I flipped through the pages, skimming over the fragments I'd written the day before. They were messy and raw, but they were mine, proof that I was trying, even when it felt like I was failing. I turned to a blank page and let my pen hover over it, unsure where to begin. The silence in the room felt heavy again, pressing against me like a tide threatening to pull me under. My breath quickened as the doubts crept in. What's the point? Will this even help? You're just wasting time. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. Instead, I pictured her, the woman in the park. Her calm voice echoed in my mind. Write what you're feeling, what you're afraid of, what you're hoping for, even if it feels silly. So I started with that. What am I feeling? I feel tired. So tired. Not just physically, but deep down in a way that sleep can't fix. I feel like I'm carrying a weight that gets heavier with every passing day, and no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to put it down. I feel angry. At myself, mostly. Angry that I couldn't see the breakup coming, that I didn't do more to stop it. Angry that I let the rejection letter affect me so much, as if it's some definitive statement about my worth. Angry that I've let my life spiral into this mess, and that I don't know how to fix it. But underneath the anger and the exhaustion, I feel something else. It's small, almost imperceptible, but it's there. A flicker of something I don't quite have a name for yet. Maybe it's hope, or maybe it's just stubbornness, a refusal to let this be the end of my story. I paused, reading over the words I'd just written. They weren't profound or poetic, but they were honest. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was being truthful with myself, acknowledging the things I'd been trying to bury. The next question came more easily. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid that I'll never get out of this place, that I'll be stuck in this cycle of failure and disappointment forever. I'm afraid that this rejection wasn't just a setback, but a sign that I'm not good enough, that I'll never be good enough. I'm afraid that I'll always be alone, that no one will ever love me the way I want to be loved, that the breakup wasn't just bad timing or growing apart, but something wrong with me, something broken that can't be fixed. I'm afraid of being forgotten, of waking up one day and realizing that I never mattered to anyone, that my life didn't make a difference. But most of all, I'm afraid of trying again. Because what if I put my heart into something and it still isn't enough? This time, the tears came. They spilled onto the page, smudging the ink, but I didn't try to stop them. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel everything: the pain, the fear, the anger. I didn't push it away or try to numb it. I just let it flow. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face and stared at the words on the page. They looked back at me like an old friend, familiar and strange all at once. I didn't feel better exactly, but I felt lighter, as though the act of putting my fears into words had loosened their grip on me. I glanced at the clock and realized I'd been writing for over an hour. The tea on the table had gone cold, and the city outside my window was now cloaked in darkness. The glow of streetlights reflected off the glass, soft and golden, and for the first time in a long time, the night didn't feel quite so overwhelming. There was one more question left to answer. What am I hoping for? I'm hoping for peace. Not perfection, not happiness, but peace. I want to wake up in the morning without feeling like there's a weight on my chest. I want to look in the mirror and see someone worth believing in. I'm hoping for connection, for people who see me, the real me, and choose to stay. I'm hoping that someday I can trust myself enough to open up to someone again. I'm hoping for a second chance. At life, at love, at everything I thought I'd lost. I don't know when it'll come or what it'll look like, but I hope it's out there, waiting for me. And maybe, just maybe, I'm hoping for a little bit of magic. Not the kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind. The kind that whispers, keep going. You're not done yet. When I finished writing, I closed the notebook and sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the room no longer felt suffocating. It felt still, peaceful, almost. I wasn't healed. I wasn't fixed. But I was moving, however slowly, towards something better. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were strange. Not bad, exactly, but not easy either. It was like learning to walk again after being stuck in bed for months. There were good days when the fog in my mind seemed lighter and I could almost feel like myself again. Then there were bad days when everything still felt too heavy and I wondered if I'd ever really move on. But through it all, I kept writing. Every night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook, pouring out the tangled mess of thoughts and feelings that had been weighing me down. Some days, the words came easily, flowing out in a steady stream. Other days, I sat for hours, staring at the blank page, struggling to put anything into words. But I didn't stop. Even when it was hard, I kept going because the act of writing, of facing my pain instead of running from it, felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. The woman from the park was never far from my mind. Her voice, her words, the quiet strength in her gaze. They stayed with me, like a faint melody I couldn't quite forget. I went back to the park a few times, hoping to see her again, but she was never there. I didn't know who she was or why she had chosen to speak to me, but I felt a strange kind of gratitude for her presence, even in her absence. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and lavender, I found myself back at the park. I hadn't planned to go. I'd simply felt a pull, like something was guiding me there. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, almost otherworldly. I walked along the familiar path, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet the only sound. The oak trees stood tall and ancient, their branches stretching out like arms, embracing the sky. The world felt softer somehow, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw her. She was standing by the edge of the pond, her silhouette outlined by the warm glow of the setting sun. She looked just as I remembered, graceful, serene, with an air of quiet wisdom that seemed almost otherworldly. My heart quickened as I approached her, unsure what I would say, but knowing I had to speak to her. "Hi," I said, my voice tentative. She turned to me, her smile as gentle and welcoming as ever. "Hello again. I've been looking for you," I admitted, feeling a little foolish. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again. "And yet, here we are," she said, her tone light but meaningful. "How have you been?" I hesitated, unsure how to sum up the past few weeks. "Better, I think. Not great, but better." Her smile widened, and she nodded. "That's progress." For a moment, we stood in silence, watching the ripples on the water as a breeze stirred the surface. The air around us felt charged, as if the world itself was listening, waiting for something to unfold. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "Of course. Who are you? Why did you talk to me that day in the park? Why did you care?" Her expression softened, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she said, "I'm someone who knows what it's like to feel lost. To feel like the world has turned its back on you, and you don't know how to find your way forward." Her words hit me like a wave, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But why me?" She turned to me, her gaze steady and filled with something I couldn't quite name. Kindness, maybe, or understanding. "Because you were ready to be found." I didn't know how to respond to that. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and emotions I couldn't quite put into words. But before I could speak, she reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but the effect was immediate and profound. Her touch wasn't just physical. It was like a current of warmth and light that seemed to flow through me, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. It wasn't a magical transformation, not exactly, but it felt healing, like something deep inside me, something I'd thought was broken beyond repair, was starting to mend. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made me believe her. "You've faced so much already, and you're still here." That's not a small thing. Tears welled up in my eyes, but this time, I didn't try to hold them back. I let them fall, let them cleanse me. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." She squeezed my shoulder gently, then let her hand fall. "You don't need to thank me. The strength was always yours. I just helped you see it." We stood there for a while longer, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. When I finally turned to speak again, she was gone. I looked around, half expecting to see her walking away, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into the fading light, leaving only the memory of her touch and her words. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. I hadn't even asked her name, but then I realized it didn't matter. She had given me what I needed, a spark of hope, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. And that was enough. As I walked home, the world around me felt different. The colors seemed brighter, the air fresher, the sounds of life more vivid. I didn't feel completely healed, but I felt lighter. Like the weight I'd been carrying had shifted, just enough for me to take another step forward. That night, I wrote in my notebook, filling page after page with everything I was feeling: gratitude, wonder, hope. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to face it. And as I set my pen down and stared at the words on the page, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever came next, I would be okay. Because even in the darkest moments, when my world had felt completely shattered, a heavenly touch had restored my hope in a single moment. And that was enough. In the days that followed, the memory of her touch lingered with me. It wasn't something I could easily explain. It wasn't just the physical sensation of her hand on my shoulder. It was the warmth that had spread through me, the way it had filled the cracks in my heart that I thought would never heal. It wasn't a magical cure for all my problems, but it felt like a promise, a quiet assurance that I had what it took to keep going. I returned to the park a few times, hoping I might see her again, but she never appeared. At first, I felt a pang of disappointment. I wanted to thank her properly, to ask her the questions I hadn't been able to articulate in the moment. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that she had given me exactly what I needed, even if it hadn't been everything I wanted. And maybe that was the point. Some things weren't meant to be explained, only felt. I started my mornings differently now. Instead of dragging myself out of bed and going through the motions, I began each day with a quiet ritual: writing. I kept my notebook by my bedside, and before I even touched my phone or made coffee, I opened it and let the words flow. At first, it was just a continuation of what I'd been doing, pouring out my fears, my frustrations, my grief. But over time, something shifted. The words on the page started to change. I began writing about the small things that brought me joy: the way the sunlight filtered through my curtains in the morning, the laughter of children playing in the park, the smell of fresh rain on the pavement. I started to notice those moments more, to seek them out instead of waiting for them to find me. I still wrote about the hard things too, the doubts that crept in when I wasn't expecting them, the sting of rejection that hadn't completely faded. But the act of writing made those feelings less overwhelming. It was like holding them up to the light and realizing they weren't as big or as permanent as they seemed. One afternoon, I received an email about a job opportunity. It wasn't from the company I'd been rejected by. It was a smaller organization, one I hadn't even considered before. At first, I hesitated. The role wasn't exactly what I'd imagined for myself, and a part of me worried that applying would only lead to another rejection. But then I remembered her words: "You're stronger than you think." I took a deep breath and clicked apply. The interview process was nerve-wracking, but different this time. I didn't feel the same desperation I had before, the overwhelming need to prove my worth. Instead, I focused on being honest about my skills, my experiences, and what I hoped to bring to the role. I walked out of the final interview feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. 2 weeks later, I got the call. The job was mine. The new job wasn't glamorous, but it was good. The work was meaningful, and the people were kind. I found myself waking up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't the dream I'd envisioned, but it was a step forward, a reminder that life didn't have to go according to plan to be worthwhile. Outside of work, I started to rebuild the parts of my life I'd neglected. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in months, apologizing for my distance and thanking them for their patience. Some relationships felt stronger than ever, while others had drifted too far to recover. I grieved those losses, but I also made peace with them. Not every relationship was meant to last, and that was okay. I even began to mend my relationship with myself. I stopped berating myself for the things I couldn't control and started celebrating the small victories. The moments when I chose kindness over criticism, courage over fear. It wasn't always easy, but with each passing day, it felt more natural. One evening, as I walked home from work, I stopped by the park. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the air was filled with the hum of life. Couples strolled hand in hand. Children chased each other across the grass, and a man played a soft tune on a guitar near the pond. I found an empty bench beneath the oak tree where I'd first met her and sat down, letting the moment wash over me. The world felt softer, more alive. I took out my notebook and began to write, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. "Dear stranger," I wrote, "I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but if I do, I want you to know what you gave me. You didn't fix me, and you didn't take away my pain, but you did something even more important. You reminded me that I could survive it, that I had the strength to keep going, even when everything felt impossible. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for giving me hope." I closed the notebook and sat back, watching as the first stars began to appear in the sky. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not perfect, not unbroken, but whole. The cracks were still there, but they no longer felt like weaknesses. They were part of me now, a reminder of everything I'd been through and everything I'd overcome. As I sat there, a breeze stirred the leaves above me, carrying a faint, familiar scent, lavender perhaps, or something like it. It felt like a whisper, a quiet presence reminding me that I wasn't alone. I smiled, knowing it was her. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just the world reminding me of everything she taught me. Either way, I was grateful. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still hard days, still moments when doubt and fear crept in. But I face them differently now. I didn't run from them or let them define me. I acknowledged them, wrote them down, and kept moving forward. And with every step, I carried her words with me. Hope is always nearer than you think, because she was right. It had been there all along, waiting for me to find it. And now I was ready,